Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 13 of the Yogic Studies podcast. In today's episode, we'll be speaking with Dr. Raj Balkaran, author and scholar of Hindu mythology. Raj and I had a wide-ranging conversation about his early days of spiritual seeking in Toronto, discovering religious studies, the power of myth and narrative in the Hindu traditions, and his fascinating work on the Purāṇas, and in particular the Devi Mahatma and Sūrya Māhātmya of the Mārkeṇḍeya Purāṇa, the subjects of Raj's two books, which we'll talk about. Raj will be teaching a new online course for us here at Yogic Studies entitled YS 112, Yoga and Hindu Mythology. In this course, students will receive a thorough grounding in Hindu mythological traditions and an appreciation for the pivotal place of Hindu myths in encoding and preserving the Hindu social imaginary, and of yogic values in particular. The course will run live from November 9th through December 4th, 2020, but as usual, it will remain open for enrollment for self-study thereafter. So if you enjoy this conversation and you'd like to study further with Raj, we invite you to join us for this special online course. Dr. Raj Balkaran is a scholar of Hindu mythology and author of The Goddess and the King in Indian Myth, 2018, and The Goddess and the Sun in Indian Myth, 2020, both published as part of Routledge's Hindu Studies series. He holds advanced degrees in Hinduism from the University of Toronto and University of Calgary. Alongside his academic training, Dr. Balkaran apprenticed with an Indian master for 12 years as part of a living oral tradition dedicated to the preservation and application of Hindu philosophy. He therefore brings hundreds of hours of traditional transmissions of yoga philosophy to the table, which he dovetails with academic rigor and captivating storytelling. A seasoned online educator, Dr. Balkaran also teaches online courses privately and at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies. Beyond teaching and research, he enjoys a thriving life consulting practice, and he also hosts the New Books in Hindu Studies podcast. So shout out to Raj's New Books in Hindu Studies podcast. We highly recommend listeners go check it out. There's some fantastic interviews with scholars in the field. And in fact, a little while back, Raj was kind enough to interview me on the New Books in Hindu Studies podcast. So go find that and listen to that if you like, where I tell my story and really the story of yogic studies. And we talk about online teaching and pedagogy, the history of yoga research, and more. So it was really fun also here to kind of get to turn the tables on Raj, who's usually the interviewer, and for Raj to get to be the interviewee. So I'm really excited to introduce you all to Raj Balkaran to host his new online course, and we hope that you enjoy this conversation with him today. All right, I'm here today with Dr. Raj Balkaran. Raj, thank you so much for joining the Yogic Studies podcast. It's really a pleasure to have you here today.
It's my pleasure being here, Seth. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and this is a particularly exciting day because we just opened up the enrollment for your new online course with Yogic Studies, YS 112, Yoga and Hindu Mythology. So congratulations on the course launch.
Thank you very much. It is indeed an exciting day.
Yeah, and I'm really thrilled to have you here to take some time to talk about your scholarship, your expertise on Hindu mythology, learn a bit about your story, and do a little preview here of this exciting new online course. But before we get into all of that, might be fun to kind of just start with where we are and how we even came here. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, we first met at one of those regional AAR conferences, the Pacific Northwest. I was a lowly master's student at the University of Washington. And where were you coming from at that time?
I was a lowly doctoral student at the University of Calgary at the time, and I had a position that year apparently I inherited the admin gene. So I was doing regional student director, I think they called it. And so part of my job was liaising with students across the Pacific Northwest for the American Academy of Religion. And I actually ended up emailing you earlier this year, but I had in the back of my mind that there was some connection. And having searched my inbox, I found that, yes, we were in touch 7 years ago.
Mm. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I know we've crossed paths again and again over the conference circuit in our fields. But yeah, I was happy to receive your email because it came at such a fortuitous moment. As I told you, I was really at that time looking for somebody to teach a course on the Purāṇas and Hindu mythology. And as often happens, these days, kind of the perfect person will kind of just enter into my inbox life. And in fact, it's fortuitous because I think we also kind of were put in touch by our mutual friend and colleague, Antonia Rupel, who, of course, is teaching our Sanskrit courses. And you did an interview with Antonia on your podcast. And of course, I had already knew of you through your podcast on the new books in Hindu studies, which I've been a fan of for a while. Because it's such a great offering, really to our field to have these conversations similar to what we're doing here, right? But in particular on new books in the field. And you did an interview with Antonia. I think maybe you did two with her. Was that right? One on her book, and then maybe a second one.
Correct. I did an interview with her spring 2019, having come across her Cambridge Introduction to Sanskrit Text and just going through it and feeling intuitively that this is a teacher who's also fine Sanskritists. You don't always, we have different stripes, right? And I approached her to interview her about the Sanskrit textbook, a little bit off of what we normally do in terms of Hindu studies scholarship. Nevertheless, I mean, by this point, we look at various developments in the field of Hindu studies, generally speaking, which brings us to the second interview. I approached her again a year later because, this sort of hobby of mine of online teaching sort of blew up with COVID-19 and it was happening at the Academy. And I came across Antonia's Sanskrit courses with yogic studies and elsewhere. And I had her on this year to talk about pedagogy and really the lay of the land. And I really feel like folks like you and her are way ahead of a curve that we'll have to fold into the Academy at some point, or we're in the process of doing so, it seems to me.
Yeah, well, I think the work that you're doing is right there as well. And so that's why I was so happy to make the connection. You've been teaching online, for years. You've been podcasting. And then you also happen to be an expert in Sanskrit narrative and Hindu mythology. And so all the stars sort of aligned there. And now here we are today with the launch, the opening of enrollment for your course, and this opportunity to explore these topics in some more depth.
The stars certainly aligned, and just to give you folks a sense who are listening, someone basically who about 2010 to 2013, I was giving talks at yoga studios in person throughout the Toronto circuit. This is before the PhD, and they just messaged me and says, have you heard of Seth Powell? And you should get in touch with him, just completely intuitively, right? She sends me a message, and I send you a message sort of rather out of left field, and not realizing now your audience, much like my audience, will know what a Luddite I am, not realizing that you ran yogic studies, or really, let's just say I joined Twitter this year and it was for the podcast. That's all we're going to say about that. But then when I came across the platform and the offerings, and it was abundantly clear that we needed to talk about this and talk about it for put it on the radar of the folks who listen to new books in Hindu studies. And then before I knew it, Seth was offering me a chance to teach there. And I think I said yes mid-sentence. Sure, we'll figure out the details, but sure. It really does seem like a good fit. And today we're seeing the fruition of that collaboration so far.
So Raj, you mentioned Toronto. I know you did your graduate training in Canada. Did you grow up in Canada?
I grew up in Canada. I grew up in the holy city of Toronto.
Mm.
I arrived in Toronto at the age of 3, so more or less all of my memory, as in it been in Toronto. I left only for the PhD from September 2011 till May 2014. I was in Calgary during, the spring and winter, the fall and winter semesters, but I came back to Toronto over the summers to teach and continuing studies and various other things. So yes, Toronto has always been home for me, and it still is.
So growing up in Toronto, I mean, a little bit, what was that like in particular? How did you start to develop an interest in Sanskrit and Hindu studies, and develop an interest to have this crazy idea that we all have to go on to graduate school to, to study these things professionally? How did your journey progress?
Well, this this person named Raj had a number of layers to his background, to my background. It's sort of an archaeological dig, because I was born actually in Guyana, former British Guyana.
Mm.
So there's a West Indian cultural heritage, the backdrop of which was a Hindu home. I mean, both Islam and Christianity are pretty popular in the West Indies, even among, Indo-Guyanese
Mm.
folks who have originally hailed from India. Now, while I had a Hindu home, it very much is akin to many of my friends and colleagues' Catholic homes growing up. They would go to mass maybe a couple times a year, and it wasn't a particularly religious home, but certainly there was a great deal of cultural affiliation just by osmosis growing up in such a home. Certainly, we observed Diwali, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so I am in Toronto, dealing with the pressures of assimilation and fitting in and all that we have to deal with growing up, but having this cultural piece and this ethnic piece and this religious piece. And so I very much pursued my studies, as I think most in our culture, with such a predilection. And I really, despite having deeply philosophical and even spiritual predilections, I grew up really what could probably best be described as sort of a Torontonian rationalist, if you will. I sort of had a relatively secular view. I sort of had my own musings about the divine, but they weren't particularly Hindu. And I went off to college at the University of Toronto to study my love, actually, English, English literature, and a minors in history and philosophy. And so really the goal at that point was to be a high school teacher and work my way up and sort of use my admin gene, as I talk about in administration, maybe school principal type thing. At some point, it was like, okay, I want to teach. I love teaching. I love the arts. I love the humanities. This is what I'll do. And life happened. There were a number of personal pressures put upon me, and coming from a very different background and setting, I had a very different mindset. I sort of had this outsider, this kind of nature mindset that's sort of part and parcel of just really dealing with the systems that we have to deal with. And there's no begrudging that. It's just the way it was. So I had this, probably the dumbest thought I've ever had. My thought was, hey, you know what? I'm just not smart enough to do a university degree, and that's okay. I kid you not. I dropped out of university. I worked full-time in an office. I was doing fine. I came from a family of laborers. I was happy to be a white-collar worker, not for not for any kind of status, but more the hours and the kind of work. I was good with administration. It gave me a chance to teach and to coach in different ways. And it took me years to realize that really what was pushing that thought was not feeling worthy of university education. And that's its own deep story that we can maybe dig into if you'd like. But I was working 9 to 5. This must be 2002, 2003. Yes. And then one of my managers said to me, look, we have a job that you would be perfect for. we'd interview you like everyone else, but we'd be certain to hire you. You'd get paid double what you're making now, and we can't even interview you. And I said, like, why not? Like, well, the job requires some kind of post-secondary education, anything, a degree in basket weaving, anything. And you know what? I said, what kind of job is it? She said, it's a sales and marketing job. I said, I've never taken a business course in my life. I've never done sales. It's really not for me. She's like, no, I assure you, this is for you. You do really well at it, and forget this job, forget this position. As a friend, as a mentor, this will hold you back for the rest of your days. Go finish your degree in anything. Have a piece of paper to say you're university educated and signal to the world that you've got, commitment. You've got, you can stick through it, whatever it is that we use degrees for in this day and age, above and beyond the actual content.
Right.
And because of that, had she been my direct supervisor, I would have thought she was trying to get rid of me, but she wasn't. She supervised a department that I wasn't heavily involved in, but we had developed a friendship. Mm-hmm. Very collegial, and she said, you have to get that. I said, I'm too old. I said, I'm 24, 23ish, 24. I'm too old. They're all like 20, 21. And she laughed in my face and said, at the age of 40, I had to come to this country and learn English and then get a job.
And you already had a couple of years of university?
Yeah, two and a half. So long story short, it was like, all right, this was summer 2004. And I was... I thought to myself, you know what? I did it the wrong way last time. I was sort of concerned about the career and trying to find what I wanted to do. This time I don't care. I just need to find one course. I knew, myself well enough to say, if I find one course that I love, I can get back into it and then we'll see what happens. So I take home the course calendar for that year. And I'm looking through, crossing out things I'll never do, like chemistry and biology and, et cetera, et cetera. I thought we'll do the process of elimination, right? I'm crossing it out. That year, this was September 2004, that year, the school year started on Thursday. And so it's Thursday. And I'm like, I still don't know what I want to take, but maybe I'll find a course that starts. I'll take it home this weekend, get the course calendar, and maybe next week I'll start. And I'm at my day at the office. And over lunch hour, I'm in my dentist chair. Right. The dentist wasn't far from the office where I worked. So I'm looking through in my dentist's chair, waiting for the dentist to come in. And I look through the U of T course offerings, Introduction to the Hindu Religious Tradition. I'm like, they teach Hinduism at the university? Obviously, I knew it wasn't theology or they weren't going to be initiating me into mantras. And I'm like, I got the sense that it was more history and philosophy, but I never knew religious studies was a discipline. And I certainly didn't know they taught Hinduism at the University of Toronto. And that was a period in my life when I was seeking, more spiritually. I was starting a morning practice. I was just hungry for ideas and content that could nurture my being on various levels. And so I thought, I really want to learn more about Hinduism. So lo and behold, this fellow who grew up in a Hindu home was more or less a Canadian kid with various, differences to most Canadian kids, I assure you. And then he discovers Introduction to the Hindu Religious Tradition one fateful day in 2004. But there was a catch. Catch is, well, what do I do? Like, this course it's at first I was like, well, can I take it? Can I get time off work to take it? Oh, it's an evening course. Great. 6 to 9. Perfect. Wait a minute. I have a shift tonight. Now, long story short, I had a side job doing catered event planning work. And so that night, I had a job and I was working with this company and they're always looking for people last minute. And one of my greatest vices is that I'm wretchedly responsible. So I would never cancel on them last minute. So I thought, this is ridiculous. The universe is speaking to me. I'm discovering this course. I feel called to go and I don't want to stiff this company. So I get back from my dentist appointment. I call the company. The owner, his name is Michael, answers. Oh, hey, how's it going? And before I could answer, he goes to me, do you want the night off? I said, what? What are you talking about? I laughed in his face. I said, you're always scrambling last minute to find people because the numbers always change and people always flake. And what are you talking about? Oh, we have extras booked for tonight. We would, if we give you the night off, we don't have to pay you out of pocket. Like, oh, yeah, sure, please. Showed up at the course. And stayed in it for that year. Once that course was finished, a year later, I took severance from the company, and I enrolled full-time to finish my BA after a couple of years. Did a master's half-time from 2007 to 2010 at the University of Toronto. Took a year off again to work to figure out if I wanted to do a PhD and why I wanted to do it, and decided, found an advisor that I resonated with and found a program at the University of Calgary, of all places. And from 2011 to 2014, I was doing the PhD.
Wow. So, I mean, that's quite a shift. So what was it about that course, those evening sessions that, was it what you were expecting? But somehow it really seemed to have kind of lit a fire in you to exceed not just the requirements of getting that job, but you decided, I'm actually going to stay on and I'm going to do graduate studies in this as well. So kind of what did you find there that you became so passionate about?
Well, I found in this course a variety of things. I found I was able to learn again, right? The love of learning, the love of people, the love of connection. But specifically in the field of Hindu studies, I can combine my love of English or literature, my love of history, my love of philosophy. My very first paper was on Advaita Vedanta, I believe, for example. And on top of that, I could leverage my burgeoning spirituality, my burgeoning seeking, right? And they all it was clear to me in the pit of my stomach that I was in the right place and the stars had aligned. It wasn't until the course was over that I fully realized the force of that in my life. Because as fate would have it, that course was supposed to have been taught by one R.T. Dond, who's currently associate professor at the University of Toronto. She was actually on mat leave with her second born that year, as fate, as Daiva would have it. And what does that mean? That means there was one sessional instructor by the name of Gillian McCann who was finishing her PhD at the University of Toronto. So Gillian McCann was my instructor. Well, who cares? Well, she was a good instructor, great. But more than that, her good friend, Gita Bexgard, ran a yoga studio. And Gillian always had a hand in practice. And it was her conviction that scholarship and practice, they complete each other, they support each other in a sense. And so her friend Gita Bexgard ran this place called the Vidya Institute in the city of Toronto. Now, there was one Indian master who was giving talks there. I met him. Essentially, I met my guru in this life through my university sessional instructor of Intro Hinduism. And I studied with at the University of Toronto.
And then at the yoga studio.
Through the yoga studio is where I met him. I call him Mantriji. He has since passed. He passed in 2017. But from about 2005 to 2017, there were some intense periods of training, lineal training on the Yoga Sutras, training on the Bhagavad Gita, training on a variety of texts. And I just laughed the other day. I was talking to R.T. Dond, who's, she's a fantastic scholar, and I think she meant this more sociologically, but she said, you know what you should do? You should be a guru. We really need a new guru. And I laughed, and I said to her, do you understand that my guru told me to be a professor, and now the professor is telling me to be a guru? It's so confusing. But just to give you some of the texture of my...
It's a tough time to be a guru right now.
Indeed.
I am curious about your teacher, though. I mean, did he come from a particular tradition or lineage? You say he was teaching the Yoga Sutra. Tell us, I mean, just a little bit about what tradition you were... I don't know if you received an initiation, but that you were being exposed to, through your teacher.
I received a number of initiations, but part of how do I say? What I can share is that my teacher was he was steeped in various traditions, and he had a variety of teachers in India of the last century before coming to Toronto in maybe 1973-ish. So in terms of like a lineage where I could point to a teacher or a brand or a line, no, I can't do that. But one other piece that's worth mentioning is that most of the teachings he initiated folks into were esoteric. He was sort of on a tantric path. And by tantra, I don't mean either the associations of black magic that we have in India or the associations of good sex that we have in the West. There's much to be said about what
important
class.
disclaimers for both
Yeah,
audiences.
yeah, it's a whole question of what classical or what traditional tantra looks like. But yes, I received a number of initiations, but no, I can't place them in a specific lineage per se.
Mm-hmm. So he was teaching Tantra. He was also teaching Yoga Sutra and other practices and texts.
By the time I met him, it was later in life for him. I guess I was with him his last 12 years. And by that time, he was teaching on what he would refer to broadly as Moksha Shastra. So he was teaching on the Bhagavad Gita primarily at that point, publicly anyhow, and Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. Those are the two primary texts that he exposited. And I probably went to 3 to 5 expositions a week for years, not counting the one-on-one time with him. So hundreds and hundreds of hours of transmissions.
And how did those experiences impact your or kind of interrelate, let's say, with your academic training that you were receiving at the universities?
Well, it's a really good question. Currently, I teach at a place called the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, and one of the things I've done is I'm starting to initiate live tutorials on Zoom. And so just this morning, there's a live tutorial on a Purāṇas course. Currently, I'm tutoring Purāṇas in Hindu philosophy. And one of the fascinating elements of the studentship there is you have folks coming for the sake of spiritual aspiration who wish to know more. You have folks who are coming who are actually grad students, or they're lifelong learners. They're the continuing studies crowd, or they just want to learn more about other cultures and the like. And I find that obviously, it being in the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, the paradigm is an Edic one, where we're looking at what empirical data we have and how to make sense of Hinduism. Nevertheless, there are individuals who have avid spiritual lives, and sometimes they're looking for a bit more. And the best way I can explain it is that scholarship and spirituality, they invoke different parts of self. And I think to really crudely simplify or generalize that, scholarship, science is the arbiter of the outer world. Empiricism is what we can know about the outer world. And I'd say that spirituality pertains to the inner world. And I think we're best served if we can delineate whether or not we're trying to understand something about the outer objective historical world, or whether we're trying to understand something about an inner spiritual experience. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but that's sort of how I parse it out. And it also depends on who I'm speaking to, obviously.
Yeah, no, that's an important contribution, I think. So as your studies developed, though, you didn't, in terms of your own research then, you had a growing spiritual practice and quest that was being nourished through your training with your teacher. Your academic interests were also developing. You didn't go on to do a dissertation on moksha shastras per se, but you developed this interest and expertise in Hindu mythology and Purāṇas. So I'd love to kind of get into that now more and unpack this fascinating, complex, and rich world and genre of the Sanskrit Purāṇas. And then we'll kind of lead that into talking about some of your recent book publications on those topics, on particular Purāṇas, and then kind of feed that into the upcoming course that you'll be teaching on some of these topics. So maybe just to begin, what are the Puranas? It's a genre or a type of text, right, that we hear about. But how do you describe the Puranas to the non-scholar?
So in 2005, when I was finishing towards the end of my undergrad, I was taking a course on the Ramayana, and I was deeply, deeply intrigued by Rama's decision to renounce his throne on the day of his would-be coronation to pacify a ridiculous request on behalf of one of his stepmothers, I guess would be the best word, because there was much more going on there. I knew that there was much more to be said between the lines. See, as a lover of language, of literature, it's clear to me that the narrative story so profoundly encapsulates the human experience. If only we know how to look, if only we have tools for processing it. And I start here to just sort of lay the foundation that Purana's narrative is ancient Hindu lore. Perhaps mythology is a word you may want to use. Myth, right? The course is called Yoga and Hindu Myth. Now, the Puranas are texts that emerge. They're next to impossible to date. Certainly post-Vedic, certainly post-Upanishadic periods, certainly around 1500 years ago. We see the Mahapuranas written, for example, the text on which I dissertated, the Devi Mahatma, the greatness of the goddess, we can date to about 5th century CE. Now, these texts, right, we can't begin to think of Hinduism as monolithic. It's a tapestry of various historical, philosophical, narratological threads. And while no one knows what's in the Vedas, and few may know what's in the Upanishads, everyone knows what's in the Puranas. Everyone knows the story of Ganesha's race around the world. Everybody knows the story of why Shiva's throat is blue. Everyone knows how Lakshmi was born. These are the popular narratives of lived tradition of Hinduism to this day. And these narratives, they are the vehicle whereby values are inculcated and perpetuated in story form. Is there something specific you wanted to ask me about the Puranas?
Why are the Puranas so notoriously difficult to date, just as compared to other Sanskrit texts?
Well, much like on Tinder, dating is a very hazardous affair in South Asia. But what do we have? Part of the issue is that the Puranas, unlike the Vedas, were never meant to be a fixed, rigid canon. The Vedas, Vedanta, the Shruti, right? That which was heard. The Puranas are Smriti, that which was remembered. It's Paurushaya, it's authored. It's not unauthored or considered unauthored by the tradition. And so the genre is a fluid genre that really defies categorization. One may point to this idea that the Puranas have these 5 marks, these panchalakshanas that define the Purana. But really on the ground, the panchalakshanas make up a very small percentage of what we see in the Puranas. Also worth bearing in mind is just the volume, the sheer scale, right? The amount of materials there are in the 18 Mahapuranas is enormous.
Yeah.
And on top of the volume, some of the Puranas have been critically edited, many have not. And so we have a bunch of manuscripts, right?
A lot of manuscripts.
A lot of manuscripts of texts that were fluid with various variants that may never have been, for example, in the Mārkeṇḍeya Purāṇa, the Devi Mahatma can be dated to a certain epoch of time, and various other elements of the Mārkeṇḍeya Purāṇa can be dated centuries earlier than that time.
Now, you mentioned this idea, sometimes the Puranas are referred to as like popular Hinduism or mainstream Hinduism. And this notion that it's these stories, these narratives that really have penetrated and shaped and influenced Indian civilizations, right? Even more so than texts like the Vedas, right? In terms of their actual content. And yet the texts themselves are written in Sanskrit, which, as we know, was an elite language, a Brahminical language that would have only been known by a small portion of the population. So what do you make of that? This notion that they're meant for all. They've had. There's no denying the impact that they've had. And yet they're also sort of encased in the secrecy almost to a certain degree, or elitism, we might even say, of Sanskrit. How do you think the Puranas were used, were read or heard historically over the ages? How did they have this impact that we're talking about?
I think it's sort of convenient to think of the Puranas as texts. And that's certainly, I would say to folks, I'm a textual scholar, I study texts. But really and truly, the Puranas are much more than text, right? What we have, I believe, are remnants of or constructions of an oral bardic tradition. So the reason why we have Puranas written in Sanskrit by Brahmins is because these stories were known. It's not that they were authored in the Puranas then became disseminated. In my view, these stories were the tissues of Hinduism. Folks knew these stories, and these stories needed proper texts.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that certainly is the case with the Devi Mahatmya, where we don't see the Devi emerging anywhere else in Hinduism. We don't see the divine as a supreme she. So why would this be Trojan horsed into the Mārkeṇḍeya Purāṇa? Well, because people were worshiping the Devi, and she needed a text, and she needed a Sanskrit text. And the powers that be, secular, not sacred, couldn't ignore this popular form of worship. So it had to be folded in. I don't know that would be dissimilar from the very nature of the Puranas. Popular Hinduism needed to be folded in, incorporated into the Brahmanic fold because it was so prevalent. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to shift. I'm tempted to take your segue there and go into the Devi Mahatmya. But before we get there, though, I do want to just ask you. I asked you what the Puranas are, but I also just want to ask kind of a simple general question. Or these general questions are never so simple, right? But that's what makes them great. But what is a myth? We've kind of, for better or worse, we've titled the course "Yoga and Hindu Mythology," and we're talking about myths. But I think sometimes that English term today, even in just popular parlance, there's this notion that myth equals false or not true, or sometimes you'll hear the phrase, "Oh, it's just a myth," right? So what is myth according to Raj? What is the function of myth? Maybe generally, but then specifically within the Indian traditions.
Yeah, that is a great question. And that is a question to which one will not find a single answer. And the fact that one can't find or delineate a particular function bespeaks the range of myth and the function of myth, ironically. And so certainly we don't mean myth in the sense of, oh, that's a myth, in terms of something fallacious that needs to be fact checked, right? We mean myth as short for mythology, for a body of lore that encapsulates grand ideas, that talks about superhuman beings, that talks about perhaps the origins of the world. Now, in the West, we typically, other people's religion we call myth, and our religion we call religion, But at the same time, all sort of narratives of divinity can be loosely called mythology. Now, in terms of what the function of mythology, why do we tell stories about the divine or semi-divine beings, right? Why do we dramatize the gods on high? Well, some would say, look, there is a sociological function to myth, right? that we need to, for example, establish our culture's place in the world. The Mahabharata, for example, it's a good example. What we see in the Hebrew Bible, for example, right? Some would say, well, there's this cosmological function of myth, this kind of impulse to frame, well, why are we here? Like, how did this all start? How did we get here? How did certain creatures get here? How did the universe get here? How did the gods get here? Right? So what I really think is extremely valuable, especially for modern learners, is prioritizing what I think of as the psychospiritual value of myth. Myth is talking not just about what we see through the telescope and what's beyond. Myth is talking about what's between our ears. Myth is talking about what's in our chest. Mythology, these seemingly fantastical stories, they encapsulate the range of human experience from the utterly abstract to the concrete, right? This is the span of myth. It has to encapsulate both poles. But I think the primacy of mythological narratives is the real power is in encoding what it means to be human and how we navigate this world. From the perspective of that myth, obviously, one's not going to find some grand unified theory of human existence. But a mythological narrative will necessarily tell you something about what it means to be human if you're paying attention.
Yeah, that's powerful. What do you say to people or to students or people who have a kind of maybe more postmodern rationalist interpretation or epistemology or view that they bring to, say, the Mahabharata or the Ramayana, and they want to ask, well, did this really happen? Did these events of the Mahabharata, did the war really happen? Do you think, is there any danger, or what is lost in kind of looking at it maybe from that vantage point? Are we missing some of these other aspects of the function of these stories as narrative?
Yes, I mean, I think it conveniently harkens to what I was saying earlier about the inner and the outer world. So I think there are research questions and methodologies that are suited towards our understanding of the empirical world. So the question of whether or not there was an historical war, that's a historical question. And that's an important question. That's not the work of myth. When one asks that about a mythological narrative, one is asking the wrong question. Because myth pertains to the inner life. So the historian or the archaeologist maybe, well, did the Mahabharata war ever happen? But someone who's more awake will say it's happening all the time. Look inside yourself. You're in a chariot with the higher self and a confused, despondent fool. You're between the armies of good and evil, and you don't know what's right or wrong. And that's your day-to-day experience. And if you don't grab those reins of those five senses, of those horses, then you're screwed. And you can't do your duty. You can't win the war. And if you don't do it, no one will do it because you were born to win this war. You see, so the question is, what is the function of the narrative? Othello never happened. It's so insightful. Hamlet, there's so much rich literature that teaches us about being human. And as soon as we think of it as divine, we're so, especially in the modern age, especially in Western culture, we're so obsessed in the question of historical veracity, we stop engaging myth on myth's terms in the story world. We're meant to enter the story world. I taught a course at the University of Toronto School of Continuing Studies where I started teaching in 2010, and I just finished teaching to make room for OCHS. And my most popular course was a course where the first half looked at ancient Near Eastern mythic narratives from Persia, from Greece, from Rome, from Egypt, and then looking at modern sci-fi fantasy, looking at Star Wars, looking at Lord of the Rings.
Sure.
Towards the end, looking at Game of Thrones. And what's fascinating is the work of that story world can be done when someone lets go of the question of dogma or historical veracity. Someone can be pulled into that world and have an experience or even an epiphany. Yet when we try to use this narrative within the story world as evidence of the world behind the text, that's perilous, right? Certainly the world behind the text influences the world within the text, without question. Nevertheless, do we not think these narratives were much more than historical records? Were they ever meant to be historical records? Right? And this is one of the pitfalls of the earliest scholars of the Purāṇas.
I was going to ask you about this, so I'm glad we went here.
Well, this was 150 years of colonial scholarship on the Purāṇas. But the problem was they were looking to the Purāṇas as historical records in some way, or ways in which to validate a glorious past, or ways in which we can corroborate something because they're expected to be consistent. And this is not, it's taken us, a while to realize, or begin to realize, certainly in this generation, that is not the nature or function of the Purāṇas. That is indeed not the nature and function of mythology in general.
Would you say, though, there's multiple functions within the Purāṇas? Because, as you said, they're really these huge records, corpus of text. And so we find all kinds of different sections, styles. We have kind of both more traditional didactic, like teaching doctrinal sections in certain epics and Purāṇas.
Absolutely.
But then we have the much more fantastical, if you will, story narratives that do different things, right?
Absolutely. And so you may have a text that is Shastric in a sense, or it's discursive, it's philosophical, or it's or it's talking about the greatness of a specific pilgrimage site, for example. The every pilgrimage site, or what one should do, or the rituals prescribed for XYZPQ. Absolutely. The Purāṇas as a genre, as an encyclopedic vehicle, contain a variety of types of texts, which is not to say they're not part of Purāṇa. What I'm responding to is the question of what is myth, what is mythology, what is narrative? What is narrative of the divine, of the beyond? What does that mean? And so the narratives of the narratives of the Hindu gods, whether or not we believe in the existence of the Hindu gods, are as much about human beings as they are about the Hindu gods. Right? Sorry, go on.
If it's okay, I'd like to now, maybe we can kind of focus in and find some examples, using your two books as a way in to talk about goddess worship, Sūrya, sun worship. Raj has authored two books as part of Routledge's Hindu Studies series. The first, The Goddess and the King in India in 2018, and then that was followed up most recently by by The Goddess and the Sun in Indian Myth, 2020. So first of all, congratulations on the recent publication. Both of these works have goddess in the title. The first one comparing or looking at the relationship of the goddess and the king, and then the second, goddess and the sun. And both of these are focusing on the Devi Mahatmya in particular, which listeners might be familiar with, but they might not know that the Devi Mahatmya is situated within one of these great Purāṇas that we're talking about. So tell us just a little bit overall, give us some background on this project that has turned into these two books. Did this grow out of your dissertation work? How did you come to the Devi Mahatmya and the Mārkeṇḍeya Purāṇa?
Yes, the book certainly grew out of my dissertation work. So when I was doing my master's on the Valmiki Ramayana, I was really intrigued by this walking contradiction of this sort of king in exile doing his duty as a warrior, but wearing bark garments. And it took me a while to really grapple with what was happening here. And, one of my first conference papers, naively, eons ago, was called Resolving Rama. There is no resolving Rama. Rama is going to be a walking contradiction for the rest of time, because his job is to encapsulate these vying ideologies of world affirmation and world denial. Those are the vying ideologies at the heart of Hinduism. And so I was intrigued.
Can you pause there? That's so important. Can you just say a little bit more about that?
Sure. So if you take a historical approach, right? First of all, the way I like to teach Hinduism is I start off and say Hinduism's a jungle. It's not a species. It's not a genus. It's a jungle. You're going to find flight patterns of birds that you may want to study. You're going to find XYZPQ. It's a jungle that has evolved with these various sort of strata from these various strata, right? And it's profoundly syncretic in that the new doesn't displace the old, as in other religious traditions. The new gets grafted onto the old. So a jungle or a patchwork quilt is one of my favorite analogies, but more so the jungle for this purpose. Mm-hmm. And so the soil, certainly the soil of the jungle, or very close to the soil, is this Vedic ethos, the sacrality of Sanskrit, this glorious ancient tongue. The efficacy of the Vedic ritual. That doesn't go anywhere, but that comes from a very specific world-affirming view, right? That strand of religion has to do with appeasing the gods and powers of nature for prosperity in the world and the attainment of heaven. Amen. Then we get this radical other worldview on behalf of the renouncers, or renouncing ideology. That's like, no, forget the sacrifice, forget the world. The world's a trap. Find a teacher, realize the self. And of course, in the earlier Upanishads, there's hot critique of Vedic ritual. Now, over the course of centuries, these two get folded in because you can't dispense with one can't dispense with the spiritual supremacy of this philosophy of realizing the self, and then one can't dispense with the Vedic platform of life in the world and ritual and prosperity and so they get folded into what I call the dharmic double helix. It's a double helix because the strands never really touch, but from afar it looks like one entity. And for me, the heart of Hinduism is the tension between world-affirming Vedic aspirations, world-denying Upanishadic aspirations. Mm-hmm. We see it in, for example, the Varnashrama Dharma system, where, okay, be in the world for these 3 stages, and then renounce for the last. We see this reconciliation, this ultimate reconciliation between, the renouncer and the householder in, for example, what Krishna is saying, in Karma Yoga. Go be a soldier with your hands and feet. Be a sage with your mind and heart.
Mm-hmm. Be a warrior, Arjuna.
Be right.
Yeah,
Exactly. And so we see this, and it's a walking contradiction because this paradox is part of the human experience. We can't dispense with the pragmatic needs of the outer, nor can we dispense with the idealistic needs of the inner, of the spiritual life, of the ideals.
This is the pravritti versus the nivritti.
This is what gets coined in the Mahabharata as pravritti religion versus nivritti religion, because the Mahabharata's job,
right,
is holding in every important strand of religion for the millennia around, plus or minus 300-400 years before the time of Christ and after, right? And so the Mahabharata is telling you, look, what you see in here, it may be elsewhere, but what you don't see in here is nowhere at all. It's telling you, we're going to fold in everything, Vedic impulses, Upanishadic impulses, devotional impulses, right? And we're going to call one pravritti religion and one nivritti religion. And those are the strands of the dharmic double helix. Now, they need not be so discursive as in the case of the Mahabharata. More profoundly, they are encoded in narrative. In what? In kings who end up in the forest, in the faces of poverty, whose job it is to turn poverty. They end up in the realm of nivriti. They end up being initiates to sages. Why do the Pandavas fast in exile? We don't know. Why does Rama wear bark garments? We don't know. The pseudo-ascetic life of exiled kings and the conversation between the Brahmana come ascetic and the Kshatriya, the Kshatriya who's a householder, right? Who's a king, in fact. This conversation is the conversation of these strands of the Dharmic double helix.
Are they also in that way? Are they following a kind of idealized varnashrama, stages of life path, as you said, which starts with the more pravritti, worldly engagement, but then at the end of one's life, this notion that even a king, and especially a king, then goes off to this nivritti, varnashrama, vanaprastha, the forest dweller, and then final sannyasin. Do you see it as that these narratives also kind of embodying that life stage structure?
Yes, 100%. Whether or not people follow that structure in South Asia, we don't know. If that people imagine that to be the ideal, we do know. And this is why the primacy is in the Hindu imaginary, because it's the imaginary that persists to this day, right? It's the imagined ideals of how we should live in the world, right? That's what persists. And asking the historical question undercuts and misses the point that this is the work of values and ideals and culture, right? They're very much alive today. The story of Rama, for example, and the themes to be gleaned therefrom. I think you particularly asked about the book, and we got sidetracked.
We did, but this was such a great sidetrack. But maybe we can wrap our double helix back to the Devi Mahatmya in particular. You were saying how, your MA work, we were looking at Rama, but that kind of launched you into this world of narrative and the power of narrative that's being overlooked by this kind of historicism. So what brought you to Devi and to the goddess? And we should note, too, for our listeners that we're right now in the midst of Navaratri festival, the 9 nights of the goddess. So let us now enter into Devi's world here.
Well, I was intrigued by the glories of the goddess, the greatness of the goddess, the Devi Mahatma. Intrigued because it's the first time in sort of Sanskrit Hindudom that we see the Mahadevi. Certainly folks have been worshiping the goddess or various goddesses basically forever, for all of recorded history. But this is the first time we see in the Brahmanic fold a Sanskrit text calling the Supreme Divine as she. And she is associated with philosophical concepts such as Maya or Prakriti. But they're not in a denigrating way. The pendulum swings the other way from the Upanishadic religion, where it's now, look, she is the supreme, right? This principle of supremacy is tantamount to Maya and Prakriti, and the world's very, very, very important. Why? The mother strives for the welfare of the world. And who is she worshipped by in the frame of the text? This is what I was intrigued by. Why on earth is a Devi Mahatmya told to an exiled king in a forest hermitage? What's going on here? Now, in researching that, I both came to understand the rich symbolism of this, which I've talked about, but I also came to understand the import it has for interpreting the 3 acts of the Devi, right? There's no coincidence that the Devi Mahatmya is framed by a narrative of a king in exile who reclaims his power with the grace of the Devi. There's no coincidence between that and the fact that her festival is the kingship festival bar none across India.
Yeah.
This is when kingship gets consecrated, sanctified, right? The connection between the Devi and the king is complex, but on some level, what is this? The mother protects, the king protects. the king needs the goddess's protection to do his protection of his citizens, to enact his protection. So there is this idea that while the Devi Mahatmya, being a classical Hindu text, it pays it pays lip service to both strands of the Dharmic double helix, because the acts of the Devi are told by a deposed king and a disenfranchised merchant, both wandering in the forest, both upset, and they both worship her. And at the end of the text, they worship her for 3 long years. Right? They create a murti on the banks of a river. They offer incense. They offer fruit. They offer water. They recite a Sanskrit hymn to her. They even offer the blood of their own limbs. And pleased by their penance, the mother appears and says, what can I give you for your penance? Well, I'm so pleased. And the merchant says, Holy Mother, I want that knowledge that takes me beyond I-ness and my-ness. I want what yogis have been seeking forever. I want liberation. He gets that. What does the king say? He says, I want my kingdom back. The goddess doesn't chastise him because she understands. His mind is clear. He's not attached to the kingdom, but he understands this is his duty to strive for the welfare of the world. This is the essence of the Devi, striving for the welfare of the world, because this world is her very body, and she's invoked as the very beings in the world, as being within all the beings in the world, in one of the most famous hymns of the text. Now, what's interesting is that in addition to being this rich narrative, that's the lens through which I studied it for my work, it also self-circulates and is ritually intoned during this time of Navaratri, the 9 nights autumnal festival to the Hindu goddess. The glories of the goddess are chanted aloud, often during fire sacrifice, but not necessarily. And this is considered her vehicle of manifestation. So there is a rich ritual life of the text. I studied it as narrative to understand the importance of the frame, and my book basically shows that the text prioritizes kingship in what might even be thought of as a subversive way, in terms of it's not the merchant who seeks moksha who's the hero of the text. It's the king who wants to remain in the world who's the hero of the text.
Yeah, and yet the merchant is also there playing that important role of kind of symbolizing that other pole, the other polarity of aspiration, right?
The merchant's name is Samadhi.
It is? Oh.
Samadhi nama vaishoham, he says to the king. His name is Samadhi.
Wow, well, there you go. Let's name it.
Totally.
That's brilliant. So that was the first book then, The Goddess and the King in Indian Myth. Tell us then how this segued into the second and more recent book, The Goddess and the Sun in Indian Myth. So
in 2014, I was essentially an ascetic with a desktop. That's what I was.
Nivritti aspirations.
Aside from my own internal nivritic aspirations, I knew that, I have to give myself to dissertating, because ABD is meant for people like me, right? Ultimately. So the dissertation broke my extroversion. I had to offer the blood of my own limbs into this dissertation. And so I knew that I had to hunker down like I've never hunkered down before. And, I have sort of personal development habits, and I'm fairly structured when I want to be. And I wrote every day. I mean, obviously I exercised, I ate well, I took breaks, but I wrote every day, 7 days a week. I had a writing schedule for about 6 months. And I ended up producing too much for a dissertation. I didn't realize it until I finally showed my advisor what I'd come up with, and she had, thankfully said, look, like, here's a dissertation and here's a bunch of other stuff.
Wow. Great problem to have, right?
Great problem to have. Well, of course you have to tweak stuff and whatnot, but some of the material that I was so intrigued by this framing principle, I took it too far, because in addition to seeing how the Devi Mahatmya was framed, I'm like, oh, well, what are the myths that are framing Like there's the intrinsic frame of the Devi Mahatmya, of the merchant and king in exile. But now let's look within the Mārkeṇḍeya Purāṇa, what's next door? What's framing the Devi Mahatmya? What's framing the Devi Mahatmya are myths to Sūrya. Now I took this further. I then said, what can we make? What sense can we make of the actual frame, the outset of the Mārkeṇḍeya Purāṇa itself? That became an IJHS article that came out last month.
Do you mean sorry, just to pause briefly? Do you mean when you're talking about the frames? You mean there's a literary framing device, right? There's the conversation that's happening with the king in exile, as you said. That sorry. And so that kind of sets up the narrative of the Devi Mahatma. But you're saying there's been an outer frame outside of that as well. Right?
So I sort of was testing this theory of mine that framing was very, 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 very important. Very important. It just hit me. And in testing that, I tested these various theories and ended up finding certain things, which ultimately became different articles. But the Devi Mahatmya starts with the story of Sūrya and talks about his story. Even when you're ritually chanting it, that narrative in the beginning of the first chapter is part of the Devi Mahatmya. It has been dismissed by earlier scholars as a flimsy frame, simply to latch the Devi Mahatmya into the Mārkeṇḍeya, into the Manvantara section of the Mārkeṇḍeya Purāṇa. Now, it may well be a narrative conceit in that sense, but it's certainly not without consequence or without careful thought.
Yeah, intentional nonetheless.
In very, very intentional. So the Goddess and the King in Indian myth basically is a publication of my doctoral thesis that looks at the king in exile, the intrinsic narrative framing device of the Devi Mahatmya, whereby I show that kingship is very important. The text is actually in a ring composition that we don't need to talk about now, but we can later. And this is extremely important. But while I was dissertating, I was so enthralled with this practice of framing. I thought to myself, how is the Mārkeṇḍeya Purāṇa itself framed? The opening and the closing of the Mārkeṇḍeya Purāṇa, the very Purāṇa. Could that tell us something about why the Devi Mahatmya is there? And so that became an article eventually. But there are the pieces that became the second book are this. Look, we have the Devi Mahatmya. It's nestled in the Mārkeṇḍeya Purāṇa. What are its neighbors? What are its textual neighbors? Right before the Devi Mahatmya, we have myths of Sūrya. Right after the Devi Mahatmya, we have myths of Sūrya. What the hell does that mean? What's that all about? So two of what I think are the most interesting discoveries of that journey. The first, I'll tell you, became the second book. I discovered that there is such a thing as a Sūrya Māhātmya. There is a Māhātmya in the Mārkeṇḍeya Purāṇa that mirrors closely the content and form of the Devi Mahatmya. But rather than lauding the Divine Mother as supreme, it lauds Sūrya, the sun god, as a supremacy, as the font of all things in the universe.
What is a Māhātmya?
A Māhātmya is literally a glorification, or it means greatness, grandeur. It's the glorification. So it's a text that tells of the greatness of often a place of pilgrimage. It's a subsection of the Purāṇa genre that's not dissimilar from the Purāṇa genre, but its specific purpose is to embellish the greatness of X. In the Devi Mahatmya, that greatness is the goddess. In the Sūrya Māhātmya, that greatness is the sun. The latter is in the second book and the former is in the first book. In addition to charting the Sūrya Māhātmya, in book 2, I show the ways in which the two Mahatmyas interplay with each other, which might be of interest. In both cases, what are they talking about? They're talking about the function of preservation. You're talking about poverty. They're talking about life in the world. What is a greater symbol of preservation and life in the world and life affirmation than the sun or the Divine Mother or the Indian king? Right? This is part of the ecosystem of the Mārkeṇḍeya Purāṇa. What's interesting in the Sūrya Māhātmya is there's this narrative about a king Rajavardhana. He reigns prosperously and wisely for a number of years, 7,000, I believe. And he's even established an heir. And then his wife starts crying one day because she spots a gray hair on his head. In that case, I'm well screwed, but that's beside the point. So there's a gray hair on his head, and he needs to now go to the forest, and she's upset. And he's very wise and saying to her, honey, what's your problem? It's okay. It'll be okay. Look, we've lived our lives. We've enjoyed pleasure. We've done our duties. We've supported the Brahmanas. It's time to go. All things must end. Wise, right? But all the citizens come lamenting after him, right? And they all propitiate Sūrya the sun. And Sūrya blesses them and says, okay, your king will live 10,000 more years. And they come back to the king and they say, well, look, we're so happy you'll live 10,000 years. And the king is sad. He's upset. He's like, how selfish. You're thinking of yourselves, but how can I live when all of you are dead? What will I do in all that time? All of my children, my friends are all gone. So now the king goes and he worships Sūrya. And he earns the boon that all of them will live 10,000 years. And they live happily ever after. This is the end of the Purāṇa. This is the end of the narrative of the Māhātmya. And you're thinking to yourself, nobody thinks, wait a minute, in 10,000 years we'll be in exactly the same place. It's fascinating. The theme of the text is valuing life in the world, even in the face of this very wise Nivritic ideology.
Mm. In listening to what you were just saying about Sūrya, it's so clear that there's this very ancient, rich longevity of Sūrya solar worship in the Indian traditions. Thinking about this, from within a more modern yoga context, we know the importance and the primacy of Sūrya Namaskara, the sun salutations, but literally the making of homage, Namaskara, to Sūrya. And while, as we know, scholarship has revealed, I think, quite clearly from my perspective, that the particular forms and sequence of yogic postures that today is called Sūrya Namaskara is really not so ancient. Really probably goes back maybe 100, 150 years. Sorry, spoiler alert for anybody who didn't know that. But nonetheless, like so many of the names of yogic postures, they convey a richness, a narratological, a mythological meaning, a cultural, religious resonance that's so much deeper and has so much more longevity. So the idea of using one's body to prostrate or to worship the sun is something that does have this sort of ancientness to it. And so, what are some of the ways in the Sūrya Māhātmya that we see the worship of the sun sort of performed or ritually enacted?
Well, the common ways in which they worship the sun is through mantra, through stotra, through praise, right? Through Sanskrit hymns, essentially.
Yeah.
Another way is through penance of sorts, fasting, right? Abstaining from food for long periods of time or partially abstaining from food. Another way that we see is actually something similar to what you may call temple worship or puja. Yeah. Now, I could be mistaken. I didn't note asanas as part of their worship. Mind you, this is sometime 5th century, probably. I'm not sure.
You wouldn't see that in a Sanskrit text.
No.
More than the very importantly though, the asana that one takes for their ritual seat in order to do the puja, to do the japa or the recitation of the mantra. That seat, that asana, does serve a very foundational and important place, but not asana in the sense of a moving or flowing, vigorous vinyasa, or even complex postures. I think at that time, right?
Exactly. I wanted to share, if I may, one other thing about that pile of stuff that came out about the sun in particular. The primary argument about the Sūrya Māhātmya is in the second book. But if I may share, there's also this really fascinating piece that came to me as I was researching. That the myth cycle right before Devi Mahatmya talks about the story of Sūrya and Samya. Sūrya becomes overbearing, and Samya's wife has to leave her doppelganger, her shadow, Chaya, behind. And it's a rich narrative, and I won't go into that narrative here. But one thing that occurred to me, because of the Ashvins and the lunar asterism Ashvini, is that myth is actually encoding the very same astronomical time that Navaratri takes place. So the Devi Mahatmya as a narrative entity was composed and latched into the Mārkeṇḍeya Purāṇa, or so I would argue. When that was done, Durga Puja, or certainly a Devi festival around this time of year, was already occurring.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I'm tempted to ask you more questions about its place within the Mārkeṇḍeya Purāṇa, but we could probably go on for far too long about all of this. So I think I will.
Indeed.
I'll hold off for now, but maybe it'll be something that will come up in the course. But let's now segue to this new online course in particular. As we mentioned, enrollment just opened today. I'm really excited about it. YS 112 Yoga and Hindu Mythology. It's a 4-week course. We've got 4 modules. Raj, tell us a little bit about this course, how you're approaching it, and just a little preview, of what students can expect.
Well, we are primarily looking at narrative. We're looking at the Purāṇas, maybe a bit from the Mahabharata and the Ramayana that overlaps with the Purāṇas. This can broadly be called Hindu myth. We are not looking to the world behind the text. We're looking to the world within the text to understand the values in vogue in the text. Because cultures preserve certain texts not because of a shortage of human ingenuity. Cultures preserve certain texts because they're relevant. Because those texts symbiotically preserve the very culture preserving them. So what a culture values ends up in the texts that culture values. And it's through exposure and engagement of that text that those values get passed on. And so we will be looking, as I elucidate and hopefully decode for you, to examples from the Purāṇas of stories that encode profound yogic insight, yogic in the broad sense of the term, in terms of this nirvritic impulse, in terms of this sort of wisdom in action, right? And so there are 4 modules, as is the case for all of the courses. In the first module, we'll talk about the power and primacy of mythology cross-culturally, and certainly in India, and give an overview of the mythological traditions of India. Right? Because just because we're looking at the Purāṇas doesn't mean there aren't mythological vignettes in the Vedas, because certainly there are, for example. Right. Then we'll specifically look to some mythology of Ganesha. Okay. The second module will be geared towards the mythology of Shiva, the great erotic ascetic, the great, Pashupati Yogeshwara, the Lord of the yogis himself. And we'll talk about a little bit about his iconography, but more so about his mythology. Who is he? What makes him tick? Why is he always meditating so much in the Himalayas? What's his role in the descent of the Ganges from heaven to earth? What is this whole Lord of Dance thing? It's Nataraja. Why does he destroy the age and cosmic dance at the end of time? What on earth does that mean? It's captivating, right? This idea. The third module, if I recall correctly, is sages. We'll look at specific sages. Well, why on earth would we do that? Oh, they're great stories. I mean, you may look at the easily angered Durvasas, who's always throwing a curse at someone because they're pissing him off, right? But in particular, we'll pay attention to this rivalry between Vasishta, the great sage Vasishta, and Vishwamitra. Vashisha the Brahmin and Vishwamitra the Kshatriya, who became a Brahmin through extraordinary effort, and their clash, their multi-millennial feud. Why? Because it's interesting? Sure. No, well, specifically because there are asanas named after these sages. Would not knowledge of the stories of these sages ameliorate how you can engage or conceptualize or relate to the asana? Of course. Now, it's not always so explicit as with the names of the sages, but it can be. The last module, it looks at a very popular and extremely rich Hindu myth about the churning of the ocean. Way back in primordial times, the gods and the demons collaborated to churn the cosmic ocean in search of the elixir of immortality. This is readily a metaphor for the yogic quest for immortality, for this elixir. Okay. And what's interesting is they don't just churn and get the elixir. There's all kinds of items that emerges along the way. In this narrative, we learn about how Shiva gets his blue throat. What does that mean for a yogi? We learn about the birth of Lakshmi, the goddess of prosperity. What does that mean? We learn about the procuring of the elixir. We learn about Vishnu tricking the demons so he can secure the elixir for the gods. What do we make of that? So that gives, I think, the general, if I recall, Seth, that's the general structure of the course.
Yeah, I'm excited. And one thing, Raj, didn't mention specifically, but I want to highlight is that each module, in addition to this lucid analysis and storytelling of just kind of decoding and unpacking these myths, but each module will also include a discussion of 5 yoga postures, 5 asanas. And not necessarily because the asanas are located historically in the Devi Mahatmya or the Mahabharata, but as Raj was saying, really because many of these asanas, they are named after either these mythological figures, sages, goddesses, or relate to very particular mythological events. And so I think one unique aspect of this course will also be kind of, in some ways, kind of mining the yogic content, the yogic themes and ideals out of these myths. And in terms of the asanas, understanding how these postures themselves relate to these worlds, these narrative and mythological worlds of the Indian and the Hindu kind of imaginaire. So I'm excited that Raj kind of added that element to this course. I think it's something that makes it special and that makes it fit particularly well with our yogic studies curriculum. Is there anything else, Raj, you'd like to add about the course or what you'll be teaching, or what can students expect? Why would somebody want to take this course with you, and what do you hope that they will gain from it?
Well, I can only tell you what I will offer. Part of my background is expertise in Hinduism, the academic study of Hinduism. Part of my background is spirituality and knowledge of Yoga Sutras in particular. And for the last 5 years, I've been online teaching. So I've been able to hone how to reach learners online and how to engage and facilitate learning. Specifically, the lectures will consist of live storytelling. That's really, really important, because when a story is told, it stays with you. And you can, it stays there and you can draw on it. Sometimes hours later, days, weeks later, something clicks about that story, or about that story in your life or your practice, or about yoga. See, that's an important piece of lived tradition that's going to be a cornerstone of the course, and of course the explication, and also the live Q&As. I quite enjoy taking questions and engaging learners, and everyone has a piece of the puzzle. So really, this course has fallen into my life much like me falling into the yogic studies, the life of yogic studies, this course has fallen into my life at a juncture where I can leverage these different pieces of my path in a meaningful way. And I'm really looking forward to it as well.
Well, fantastic, Raj. I know we're all very excited, and we encourage folks who are interested in exploring the world of Hindu mythology, the epics, the Purāṇas, where yoga fits into all this. We hope you'll join us for this exciting course. I think we'll leave it there for now, Raj. We can't say too much more. We want people to take the course. We can't give it all away here in the podcast, right? So,
indeed,
this was a wonderful conversation. Honestly, just great to get to know you a little bit more. We kind of as we began, we have a little bit of a background, but it's nice to develop that relationship further through this and learn about your fascinating story. And I'm excited to go read more of your scholarship now on the Devi Mahatmya. You left me with a lot more questions to explore. So thank you so much. Any final words or anything you'd like to add before we sign off?
No, it's I'm so used to being the one signing off. I was going to go into my New Books Network's typical sign off of something along the lines of, keep reading, keep listening, stay safe, and keep contemplating yoga and Hindu mythology.
Good.
But we won't do that here. We'll simply say thank you, and I really look forward to any and all of you who want to engage this work with me.
All right. Thanks so much, Raj. Thank you to our listeners, and everybody, please take care. And as Raj said, do keep studying, keep inquiring, and hopefully we'll see you online soon. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Raj. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Yogic Studies podcast. If you've enjoyed this conversation and would like to support the show, please consider leaving us a positive review and rating on iTunes. As always, we are grateful for your support. Thanks so much, everyone, and please take care.